As Talmo said, we have almost like two versions of this presentation. We have a synthesis version, which is going to be shorter. It's going to be focusing a bit more on the motivation for the work we have been doing, a very high-level description of the pipeline that we have put together to, I guess, create the data set and undertake the analysis and generate some findings. And then I'll present some example findings and consider the implications. And that should take 20 minutes, I think 25 minutes maybe, and we can discuss. And then after that, there's like I'm not gonna show you everything. After that, there's like the deep dive, and the deep dive is, I don't know, it's getting into much more detail about the data, about the methodology, about the robustness, many more visualizations, many more, I guess, like examples of what we have been doing. And actually, it might be the case that some of the questions that you have in part one, we can answer just by looking at part two, because that's where we are really opening I guess, the engine of the project and looking at what's in there and how it works. I think like one thing to say about this project is that basically what I'm going to be presenting to you is part of a project we are doing in collaboration with the Scottish government in the UK. And basically a Scottish government, like many other governments in the world, obviously have experienced the shock of Covid-19 in their local economies, in their industries, and they have found that having national level data is not enough to inform their policies to tackle COVID-19, because the impacts of COVID-19 are being quite heterogeneous across different locations, depending on their industrial composition, for example. And it's also being quite diverse, almost like at the level of individual firms. Individual firms are responding to COVID in different ways, and that's kind of conditioning or shaping the impact that COVID has. So they were looking for novel data sources to explore, to maybe give them information which was more granular geographically, more timely, and more granular also at the level of individual firms. And basically, we have been working with them in a pilot to explore opportunities around that. I'm going to be presenting emerging findings from that. And actually, some of the things I'm going to be presenting you are going to feel more like findings, even though all of it is quite work in progress still. And some parts I'm going to be presenting to you is more completely work in progress. And actually, in some cases, I'm going to be telling you about the things that we have tried that just didn't work or are almost like proving too challenging for a pilot. And maybe, this gives you a sense of obviously how exciting some of these methods are and some of the opportunities they offer us, but also some of the challenges you face when you explore novel data sources and methods, and how things just sometimes don't work, or you realize that it's going to be too expensive to scale them up and you just have to park them, at least for now. So yeah, so it's like maybe some preliminary remarks, and with that I'm going to get into the part one of the presentation, which is the synthesis. I mean, one thing I'm going to say before getting into this is also one thing that I haven't really included in this presentation, but I'm very happy to discuss, is maybe almost like even more detailed conversations around tools, around like packages we have used, around specific technologies and things like that. Like we can also discuss that as well. And if you have any questions, almost like at the level of almost like the mechanics of the project, we can also discuss later. Maybe that's almost like a deep dive on the deep dive, so probably something that comes up towards the end of the meeting. All right. So in terms of the synthesis, so I guess what's the framework we are using to think about this problem? So basically, we're in a situation where COVID-19 has obviously had a big impact on our economies, has had an impact on the demand side. Obviously, if we have social distancing and people can't get together in places, then that limits the demand for sectors that involve people being close together. An obvious example of that kind of thing is a concert. That the arts and creative industries have been greatly impacted by COVID-19. And then also like creates uncertainty in the sense that, if we don't know what's going to be the nature of demand in different industries, that it might, again, reduce levels of investment, which is going to have impacts on demand for B2B industries and things like that. And obviously on the supply side, there's a lockdown. If people can't go to work in some industries, it's going to limit their ability to produce. So we have this shock going on. And obviously this shock has like some direct and some indirect dimensions going on. It's a complex system. And in response to the shock, we see adaptation, right? It's not like firms are completely passive actors within this situation who just experience the shock and then there's an impact. They change what they do. They might, for example, change in terms of the scale of some of their activities. So grow in some areas, like reduce activity in other areas. There's the idea of scope. Obviously the example of that we had in the UK is like, I don't know, Rolls-Royce taking, they would obviously make cars and engines. They also moved into making ventilators because they had the capabilities to be able to do that. And then we have innovation, in terms of like firms doing things in new ways. And obviously, like the most kind of obvious, almost like a cliche example of innovation has been the adoption of, online e-commerce and I guess like the delivery services in all sorts of like businesses that are not able to open because of lockdown and social distancing. So you have this kind of adaptation, and then you have obviously that creates an impact, and the impact again like has an effects on supply and demand, and it's like this a system, I guess, with feedback loops. And I guess in terms of like the policymakers, that we work with, and this obviously includes, as I said, Scottish government, but other people we speak with as well, and obviously like policymakers in the audience or people who speak with policymakers, would be great to get your take on this. We get these questions around what firms, sectors, and places are most exposed to the shock from COVID-19, and identifying that would inform policies to mitigate. If we identify a local economy where a big percentage of the population is at risk of COVID-19, then we might want to put in place almost like interventions within that location to support the economy. At the level of firms, if we identify firms that are at risk of failing, if we could like almost like predict what firms are at risk of failing, we could almost like proactively engage with them rather than almost like have to act once they have failed and gone bust and laid off lots of people. So we would like to have this very kind of timely and granular information about what's going on with exposure. And then obviously we want to understand how businesses are reacting to the shock, and also inform policies to adapt. I guess there's like almost like an acknowledgement that the world in some ways is going to change in response to COVID-19. There's going to be some new things happening, and that innovation policymakers especially shouldn't almost like stand on the way of that innovation. They should enable it. And also there's an angle that, I was in an OECD workshop yesterday talking about this, that the idea that the world wasn't the perfect place before COVID-19, there were lots of things we didn't like about it. And actually, in a way, some of the fractured lines that have been revealed by COVID-19 and its impact give us opportunities to adapt in ways that allows us to, I guess, build back better. Is like this kind of slogan that's being pushed, by the Biden administration, like incoming administration. It's also a term being used in the UK. So how do we, again, identify what are like future paths for our economies, and how do we enable them? So lots of like very important policy questions that obviously we would want to answer in a way that's based on evidence. So we need relevant, inclusive, timely, and trusted indicators about all of this stuff so that we can, I guess, develop these policies in very firm grounds. So what's the nature of the evidence available around the economic impacts of COVID-19? So I guess, at one level, you could say that and by the way, in this presentation, if you click on the annex, you get some of the references, although the list might be a bit out of date because obviously there's been so much research being published in this area in recent months, but there's some examples in the annex. So how have been people generating evidence about the impact of COVID-19? So they have been using labor market data, and this is, looking at business surveys and things like that, and basically measuring the sectoral exposure to COVID-19. One thing that people have been using a lot is basically almost like look at individual occupations, like say what occupations are better able to work from home or less able to work from home, and actually then use that to almost estimate supply side shocks. So if this industry has lots of people who can work from home, it's going to be less impacted. If this industry has lots of people who can't work from home, it's going to be more impacted. And then they also have been considering, for example, what is the characteristics of the occupations which are more or less able to work from home. And I guess the general kind of stylized fact within that is that better educated, better paying, more productive occupations generally, because they tend to be knowledge intensive, it's easier to work from home than other occupations, maybe in very lower paying industries. Obviously, the nice thing about working with labor market data and labor market surveys is that this is using official data, which is representative, is comparable, which is great. Hello? I heard someone say.
Please mute your microphones if you're not speaking. So, okay.
So that wasn't a question. No?
No, I don't think so. There was a question.
Me like one note to flag up, like as I go, and I should have said this at the beginning, is that because I'm presenting, I can only see my screen, I can only see the presentation. So if anyone has any questions or any points for clarification, whatever, you're gonna have to interject because I'm not able to see you at this point. So, I mean, I was saying, talking about labor market data, and I guess I was talking about how great it is in many ways, and I love it. Like, I love to work with it, but also it has problems. Obviously, it's got lags. It takes time to run surveys and then to analyze. And also, there's like the issue of explainability. You might see some patterns in the data, but because it's a statistical aggregates, actually to understand what's driving a phenomenon is not trivial. Obviously, we have theories that help us to understand some of the trends, but it's not like you can just go and talk to the company or talk to the worker about what's going on in their situation. And also they assume homogeneity. They assume that all occupations are the same. So if you are a waiter, basically you are the same as all of the other waiters, and you are going to be impacted by COVID in the same way. We know that maybe some firms that employ waiters respond in some ways to COVID, and some others respond in different ways, and actually that might have an implication for their exposure to COVID and the impact that COVID has on their jobs. So we would like to break that up a bit further if possible. The other kind of like data source that people have been using is business panels. And obviously this is where basically you just run like a survey of businesses, and you could run a survey today, create like a random sample of businesses and ask them, what's been the impact of COVID on you? What are you doing about it? What's going to happen in the future? Obviously, the nice thing about this is it's super relevant because you are asking them specifically about the impact of COVID, and you might even ask them about the mechanisms underpinning the impact that COVID has on them. It's comparable, I guess, insofar it's a random survey that's representative, like of a national economy, or I guess stratified in a way that allows you to compare regions or sectors. And it's also timely, in principle, you can do this quite quickly. The problem obviously is around response biases. We know that businesses that have been struggling with COVID, especially SMEs and micro businesses, have had a decrease in response rates to business surveys. So you might end up only talking to the ones that have the time to engage, which might be the ones which are suffering less. Also, like these surveys tend to be quite small sample frames, obviously, that creates problems in terms of the level of granularity at which you can draw inferences from the responses. So very often what you get is, you can say things about Scotland, you can say things about the UK, you can say things about very high level kind of sectors, but not about like region, local economies or more granular sectors. And as before, they assume homogeneity. They kind of assume that a business that responds to the survey and says that it has had impact X is representative of all of the other businesses out there, when we know that there might be some heterogeneity. And actually, that's one of the things that's coming out from some of the literature on the impact of COVID-19, is that firms, even within the same sector, are responding in very different ways to COVID. And then finally, I guess you get into the big data, which is what we're going to be focusing on today a bit, which is all of the other kind of like more esoteric and novel data sources that you could use to look at this evolution of the economy. You can look at what businesses are saying in the earnings calls. You can look at transaction data, like say from credit cards. Like there's really cool work that's been done around that by people in the BBVA, the BBVA, the Spanish bank, in collaboration with researchers like Vasco Carvalho in the UK. You can look at demand for jobs, looking at online job ads. And also you could look at websites, which is what we're going to be doing here. And the idea is that websites might be able to tell you something about the impact of COVID-19 on individual businesses. This is timely. In principle, it could almost be in some ways real time, depending on your source. Like credit card transactions, like literally you can pick that up on real time if you have access to the data. That's like a challenge. It's very granular. You have individual transaction data. If you're looking at business websites, it's firm level data. So maybe it helps you break things a bit in terms of like that assumption of homogeneity you have to make when you're working with the more statistical data sources. You don't have to do that with the big data. But there's questions about representativity, comparability, reproducibility. Is it representative? How do you compare different places, different countries? And if you're working with private data, how reproducible is it? Can actually another researcher look at what you have done and reproduce it and show, I guess, that your results are robust? So yeah, and I guess like what we're doing in this project is working with one of these big data sets, and I guess trying to how would I say, make the most of their advantages while addressing some of their limitations. And I'm going to tell you a bit about how this works. So basically what we're doing is we are working with business website data. And actually we have licensed this from a startup in the UK called Glass AI that has like 1.8 million business websites. And these have a bunch of things, including obviously name of the company, description of what it does. They have the postcodes that the business mentioned in their website. Obviously, they have the URL, things like that. And this, for example, can be it can have a description like this one you can see here. About the company that does live events, award ceremonies, theater and performance staging, blah blah blah. What we have done is we basically combine this with business registry data from the UK, which is Companies House, which is like an open data set with information about businesses, including their name, their location, where they are registered, their industrial code based on the standard industrial classification we use in the UK. And basically what we do is then for all industries, because we're able to extract the industries from the business registry, we create a vocabulary of terms that relate to that industry. So for example, we would aggregate all of the businesses in the arts, and then we would look for terms that appear in websites that are specific to the arts, like dance, theater, comedy. You can see an example here. And then we run those terms against Google search. And the idea here is to almost like look at what's like the level of consumer interest or I guess a proxy for demand for, I guess, the kinds of products and services that these industries sell. And basically, once we have done that, we are able to create a ranking of industry exposure to COVID-19. So the idea here is that businesses that have seen a big drop in search interest, say this year or a month of this year compared to a month of last year, they are businesses that are more exposed, or sectors that are more exposed than those that have seen less of a change. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like in a moment. So this is just, by the way, just showing you the pipeline. I'm still not showing you findings. And then the idea is that we can then, having identified what sectors are exposed to COVID-19 at different levels, so the ones that are more exposed or less exposed, then we can actually combine that with official data and say, and this is a map of Scotland, by the way, what parts of Scotland, based on the composition of their labor markets, are more or less exposed to COVID-19. And actually, we're able to do that on a monthly basis because we have this kind of search information on a monthly basis. So it's quite timely and it's quite granular. And it's super important to say it's relying on business website data, open data, proprietary data that we're never able to open through access through an API and official data. So it's a bit of a complex pipeline we have built here to do this. Then what we do is also, because we have a label data set here where we have the industries that we have got from the business registry, plus the text descriptions that we get from the websites. We have basically trained a classifier that basically uses the text to predict the sector where a company sits. And basically this generates predictions for all possible sectors. So instead of like forcing companies to be in a single sector, we get for each company a vector of probabilities that it belongs to all of the different sectors. And this is much richer than what you get from the C codes, right? Because you're actually able to say, if a company is operating in multiple sectors at the same time, which we know happens, then we should be able to get a vector that has high values in more than one, dimension. And then because we are able to do that, then we can also look at similarities between sectors based on what sectors tend to appear in the same companies. This allows us to create this kind of like network map of opportunities for diversification. And the idea here is that if a sector is very close to another sector, it might be able to diversify into it. And maybe that diversification helps a company that's in a sector that's exposed to COVID move into an economic area which is less exposed to COVID. And this basically is going to tell us something about local resilience. And then finally, because we have the businesses, we also can look at some other super rich data about what the businesses do. Actually, one thing that we are getting from the businesses is not just their descriptions. We also get these things which are the COVID notices, which is when a business has posted something on their website saying, oh, like this one here, our physiotherapy practice has had to close temporarily due to the coronavirus crisis. Actually, we have that information for all businesses in the data, and we can also analyze that to generate firm level measures of response to COVID and also adaptation to COVID. We're going to see that some businesses say, we are shut, but you can order from here, or we are shut, but we are doing a sale, or all of this kind of thing that maybe help us to tell us something interesting at the firm level. And I must warn you that this is the area of the project which is less developed, which actually is much more complex, this kind of analysis, than what we have been doing at the aggregate level. But I'll give you some thoughts on how we have been progressing with that and what some of the opportunities and challenges are around that kind of analysis. So I like the pipeline, and obviously this is super high level. We can talk about the detail later, but I thought it would be useful just to give you the very high level picture. Just to give you a sense of like some of the findings, and actually I'm just gonna have like 3 or 4 slides of like findings and then conclusions. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Tarmo, in terms of this first phase.
All good.
Okay, great. So this one's a bit complex, but basically what this one's showing is on the can you see my cursor, by the way, where I'm pointing in the screen? Yeah?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay, great, yeah, because I'm just gonna be kind of taking you through the chart because it's a bit complex. Basically, this is like months, like the y-axis is months, so this is January, February, March. And basically what this is showing us is the search for, like these nodes here are terms. So actually I'm gonna click here, and by the way, you will be able to do this offline, like with the presentation as well. So actually each of these things here is a keyword, right? That relates to a sector. And actually if the keyword is more than one, this means that for that month, the level of search for that term was higher than in 2019. And the idea is that we want to normalize search volumes in 2020 by 2019 to get that seasonality. And basically what this is, obviously it's not super interesting. What's interesting is like when we get to March, which is the COVID crisis. And the idea is what things were people looking for in March, much more than they were last year. And actually things like symptoms, stock news, workers, self-employed, almost like because we know that self-employed people were particularly hit by the pandemic. So we start to see that people are interested in these things and are going to be less interested in other things like weddings, rugby, because rugby was shut down. And basically the colors are going to tell us about the sectors that are exposed. And basically what's interesting, for example, here, this one is deliveries. Like in April, everyone was interested in deliveries because no one could go to the shops. No one was interested in holidays and theaters because you couldn't go to them. And over time, we're going to be able to look at this kind of pattern, right? And I think this is interesting because it's telling us something about consumer interest as a proxy for demand for services and products that are supplied by different sectors. And actually, just going back to the presentation itself, as I said, symptoms, everyone interested in symptoms in March. Bread in the UK, I don't know how it was in other countries, but in the UK, like on April, everyone started making bread because everyone was really bored at home. But people looking for bread. And in July, people who would have been looking for airports, not looking for airports because obviously you couldn't fly anywhere, or much less than you could have in the previous year. So I guess like this is kind of telling us that, whoops. Sorry, I'm just lost my browser. Here it is. So it's like, I mean, this is like a sanity check. This is telling us that the Google search data seems to be trending, like tracking consumer interest for products and services that is consistent with our priors or like our intuitions about what would have been happening, which obviously is nice. You know, it gives us a sense that, okay, this looks like a potentially useful data set to look at exposure to COVID at the level of industries. What we then do is basically aggregate all of the search trends related to an industry and average them. And then basically what we do is look at what industries have very low levels of search compared to previous year, and what industries have more levels of search. And I guess the idea here is that the ones that have low levels of search are the ones that were more exposed, and the ones that had more levels of search compared to last year were less exposed. And again, here, you know, this is interactive. This is the thing is like with this kind of charts, because they have so many dimensions, it's quite difficult to put them in a static chart. So we put them in this interactive where you can actually look at examples of things that were more exposed, like libraries. Obviously, you couldn't do cultural things, so lots of very limited interest around them. Sports activities, things like that. The things that were less exposed, because I guess they are less subject to social distancing. Advertising, warehousing, obviously we know a lot of interest in warehousing and deliveries. Computer programming, I guess a lot of digitalized activity going on. So it's like almost like the losers and I guess, I mean, I don't know if you can call anyone a winner in the battle against, like in the COVID situation, but I guess the ones who are less loser or less exposed. So again, like this seems to make sense in terms of our intuitions. And what's nice about this is that not only are we're getting like a sense of what sectors were impacted, but also we are getting a sense of like the timing of the impact. For example, again, like in the UK, actually, you know, in the summer, you know, we ended the lockdown and everyone was a bit like, yay, you know, it's almost like the crisis is over, we can go on holidays. And actually accommodation in the summer seems to be less exposed, because actually some people were looking for where to go on holidays in the UK. Construction, which is this one here, was the opposite. Actually, during the lockdown, it was like a complete disaster and everything was shut and very few people doing construction. But then afterwards, a lot of construction going on, not least because people wanted to improve their houses because they thought that they might be spending a lot of time inside of them. So actually, again, we see big exposure and then less exposure. Again, consistent with the idea, the set of priors we have, which is good. I mean, in the sense that if we had found very big differences, then that might have called into question the quality of the data or what it's telling us. But in this case, it looks like it's a useful proxy to monitor how different sectors are being exposed to COVID-19. And then basically what we can do is once we have these levels of exposure, we basically combine that with the labor market data. For example, we know the levels of employment in different parts of Scotland, in different sectors. And we use that to scale up, like basically say, okay, how many people in Argyll and Bute, I think is this one, is working in industries which are highly exposed, and we can do that on a monthly basis. Yeah. And basically this is giving us quite highly granular, I guess, estimates of exposure to COVID. And we can use this to look at trends over time, like for different places. And again, this is interesting for policymakers, right? Because they can look at almost like what are the places that are most exposed and less exposed, but also they can look at the reason for the exposure. So what this one is doing here is telling us level of employment in a local economy in different sectors, and sectors which are in the lowest level of exposure to COVID and in the highest level of exposure to COVID. And I think this one is for October, but you could look at how it evolves over time, and we can look at the situation for different regions. And Argyll and Bute, which is like that like region that appears like as having like high exposure, actually we can see that the reason for this is that they have a lot of people working in accommodation, a lot of people working in creative, libraries, the sectors that have really suffered from COVID. Whereas if you look at, I think one that didn't suffer was this one called Clackmannshire. And this one doesn't really, it's not as exposed because actually that don't have as many people working in creative or accommodation. They have lots of people working in retail and construction, manufacture of non-metallic mineral products. So again, like we get a sense of how the local composition, the composition of the local economy explains why there are more or higher or lower levels of exposure to COVID-19. I guess like one, obviously, everything that we have been talking about here is very almost like about exposure. What does this mean in terms of impacts? So actually what we do is look at the correlation between exposure of a local economy to COVID and the number of people claiming like unemployment benefits on that month. So the idea is, do we find that is our measure of exposure highly correlated or not with levels of a number of people claiming benefits? And this again normalized by the previous year just to account for seasonality. And we find that actually for some of the months there's a very strong correlation. And there's not just like that. Say for example, this is showing that in April the number of people claiming benefits, the rate, sorry, it's not the number, it's the rate of people claiming benefits was very strongly correlated or quite strongly correlated with the share of people in jobs that were exposed to, in industries that were exposed to COVID, but also they are correlated with what was going on the previous month. So we have a sense of like maybe some of the aftershocks of the impact of the impact of COVID actually during like the summer, because there was less of an impact, like some things were becoming normalized. We see less of a correlation. And now in recent months, as we go back into the lockdown in the UK, again, we start to see a stronger correlation. So I guess like the takeaway from this example is simply that our measures of exposure seem to be correlated with I guess, the economic impacts of COVID in terms of unemployment in those local economies that specialize in sectors that are more exposed. Then, I mean, so this is like this is the idea that in addition to looking at how exposed a sector is to COVID, we can also consider whether a sector can diversify into other activities. And basically, the way we have calculated this, I told you the intuition before, is look at what sectors are more similar to each other based on the descriptions in their websites. And basically, what this shows, for example, is that this 62 is computer programming, is here and is quite close to this one, which is telecommunications, and this one, which is information service activities. So actually, it can diversify into these different areas. And the color indicates, like green color is not very exposed to COVID, and red color is very exposed to COVID. So basically, it's showing us that this sector that is not very exposed to COVID actually might be able to diversify in other areas anyway. If we look at retailers, which is 47, they could move into wholesale, which is 46. And actually, this is the example of shops that used to, you could go into the shop and buy, start to deliver. Arts and creative, like 90 here, they could actually move into video. And this is the idea maybe of like starting to do like live streaming or like online distribution of like creative content and things like that. And again, it's an example of how a sector that is very constrained by the impact of COVID to an area which is less constrained. But then if you look at accommodation, actually accommodation is not so easy to diversify away from COVID, because the main thing they could move into is 68. Actually, I don't know what 68 is, but again, they can move from one sector that is exposed into another sector that is exposed before they can move into another sector where they are less exposed. So it's telling us that maybe the places that are specializing in accommodation may be a bit tougher for them to diversify in a way that almost like tells them to avoid like the shock of COVID, like get away of the COVID floodplains, as it were. And yeah, I mean, what we do is we have done some regression analysis. I'm not going to get into like all of the detail, but what this shows us is that basically those locations that have lots of people working in sectors that are exposed to COVID with low opportunities to diversify from COVID see a higher increase in unemployment than the others. And this is after we control for other things. And the regression we run, we're using this kind of variable to explain the link between exposure to COVID and impact on employment. Unemployment is much higher, like the R2, I guess, like the goodness of it, than when you consider simply exposure without taking into account diversification opportunities. So those are like the key findings. I mean, one thing that I guess I really haven't done in these findings, because it's more work in progress, is talk about the analysis of COVID notices, as well as the analysis of business failure, because we are currently still doing that. I think like one thing to say about the analysis of notices, and actually I'm just gonna go to the right part of the presentation to show you, is that we have done like some topic analysis of COVID notices. And we find like, I guess, this is quite preliminary and quite messy, but we find that some topics, like some types of notices, are picking up almost like different, almost like stages of the virus, and this is linked to the months when they appear. Like a topic related to lockdown, a topic related to socially distanced reopening. So it looks like the notices are helping us to almost like monitor how businesses were responding to the pandemic. And then what's interesting, and yeah, this is like quite hard to read, but it's just, I mean, it's not as polished as some of the other things I've presented. It's basically what we find is that when we look at the almost like the composition of response of notices in different sectors and how diverse that composition is based on measures of diversity, we find that sectors that are more knowledge intensive tend to have more diversity in their responses. And we interpret that as evidence of the fact that those businesses might have more opportunities to diversify from COVID. Whereas those businesses which are less knowledge intensive actually might have less opportunities to diversify. And also, like what this tells us is a lot of heterogeneity in business responses to COVID, which again is consistent with the idea that, like this kind of like almost like in sectoral aggregates that we are able to look at through the official data might mask a lot of variation in how businesses are responding to COVID. And one of the things that we really want to do, I guess, as a next step, and actually something we are exploring now, is whether we can use this more like high granular information about business responses to COVID to enrich our models of impact, almost like impact of COVID on unemployment, to enrich these kind of models with the more timely data based on firm level responses. And obviously we find that incorporating into this kind of model the more like detailed data, I guess, increases our goodness of fit, our ability to explain unemployment outcomes. This suggests that kind of information is helping us to understand better what the impact of COVID is. And just to conclude, so our analysis highlights the potential of novel sources. One super important thing to say is that this is complementing official data. We are using it all the time. One thing I haven't even talked about is validation. So how we validate both the business website data and the trend data with official data. We do that as well in a way that suggests that what we are doing is not horribly biased or is missing out big chunks of activity, both in terms of sectoral activity or not tracking trends related to the pandemic that have come from official sources. Our findings are consistent with the idea of recovering consumer interest, but then like a fall when we get into lockdown. And they also suggest that the fortune of local economies hinges on their ability to diversify away from COVID-19 impacted sectors. This suggests that the local economies that are able to diversify seem to be the ones that are more knowledge intensive and more complex. And this suggests that maybe the locations in the UK which are already doing better economically are the ones that are going to be able to continue doing better or suffer less from COVID-19, and this might increase regional inequalities, which is something that we would be very unhappy about, and the government would be very unhappy about and would seek to tackle. And I guess this kind of like data that I've showed you and this kind of analysis, we feel that because it's more granular, it's more timely, it could help inform policies to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of COVID-19, and especially maybe to avoid some of those negative effects like an increase in regional inequalities as a consequence of the virus. So I think that's it in terms of the first presentation, which is a bit less deep. I'm afraid I probably gave you a lot of detail there. But anyway, yeah, that's it for now. Before we get into
yes. Thank you, Juan, for this very nice overview. So for those of you who joined later, so the idea was that this was a more general presentation, and let's keep the discussion now a bit more general, asking general questions, and then we can go into the more details on the methodologies, and Juan can show additional slides, and he has plenty of them to show as we could see. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, and this actually picks up some of the things that people that have come up. So I think like there's one limitation with this is we have so much tuning going on in these pipelines, at almost like at all points you have like thresholds that you have to select. You have like parameters that you have to select. You know, and I think that there's like a lot of tuning we could still do, like to improve the quality of the results. The only question is, what's the ground truth for that tuning? In some cases we have like a labeled data set, and then in a way you have a ground truth. But in some other cases you don't. Like, what is the best vocabulary to describe what a business does? That's arbitrary to some degree, you know, and you can be more demanding, and that is going to give you a more precise set of businesses when you look for them, or you can make it more like a bit more broader, and that's going to give you more recall, but it's going to start to create false positives. So I think like to find a way to tune the pipeline without spending infinite amount of time doing that is quite tricky. One way to do that is almost like find what is the configuration of the pipeline that gives you the best performance in explaining a variable of interest. Like, for example, what configuration of the pipeline gives us best predictive power when looking at impacts of COVID on unemployment in a local economy. We could do this kind of thing, but it's again like a lot of work, and maybe the results are not that explainable, or they are just a bit of a fluke. Obviously, there's the question of, I guess, when we're modeling the link between our variables and impacts on a local economy, what other factors do we consider? Again, like the fantastic questions that colleagues have been asking throughout the presentation, you know, like how do we consider like internationalization options, what's locally traded, what's like nationally, internationally traded? Again, how do we bring all of that in within reason? You know, I think like some of the SIG codes, we love them because they are standardized, and once you move into the SIG codes, then you can start to work with official data, which is less complex. But, you know, obviously that loss of complexity comes at a cost in terms of like granularity, and the fact that very often you're going to end up working with SIG codes that are very uninformative. You know, like probably you have this in all taxonomies, but, you know, other service activities not elsewhere classified, other manufacturing activities not elsewhere classified. It's very difficult to work with this kind of information if you want to say anything about exposure to COVID, because the content of that sector is going to be so heterogeneous. And actually, we are now working in a project with the Economic Statistics Center of Excellence, which I mentioned before, to see if we can start to develop some more bottom-up industrial taxonomies and see whether those kinds of like taxonomies are more almost like enhance our ability to understand the impacts of COVID and other things. I mean, before we talked about supply shock and demand shocks, it would be great to expand that. And I mean, obviously, one thing that we would really like to do is like look at the firm level. Like we haven't really done that already, and maybe that's been the biggest challenge. Has been the more granular you get into your analysis, going from say sectors to places to companies, the more complex it gets, just in terms of like the level of noise in the data. So, for example, we did this topic model of the COVID notices in the websites, and it was super messy, like very noisy. But the policymakers would optimally like to get something that's firm level rather than sector level or place based. So the question is, how do we almost like reduce some of that noise or communicate it in a way that doesn't overwhelm people? So like a big challenge. And then a big challenge for us, and maybe this is almost like something that none of us can do as researchers, but maybe we can do as people who engage with policymakers and statistical agencies who collect data, is that one of the ideas for the project that everyone was very excited about was that if we could like match, say, the business website data with data about business failure, like say whether a company goes out of business or a company becomes insolvent, then we could train a model that would help us to use what businesses say on their website to predict whether a company fails or not. And once we have trained that model, then we can use it in the future to almost like generate predictions about what might happen in the future. Like say, this company in this sector is talking about doing like a big sale on their website. That does it suggest that they're about to go out of business, you know? Obviously, it's good to know that, and actually, in some cases, it's good to know it because maybe we can do something about it. So, you know, if a big supermarket is going out of business in a small village, then this might have a big impact on the local labor market. You know, we'll be able to identify those kinds of impacts would be great. And what we found is that basically it was very difficult to put together that data set because the business failure data in the UK is too laggy, takes too long for it to become official when a company goes out of business. And what this means is that because this field is moving so fast, we wouldn't know if the model we have trained on this laggy data would be relevant for the future, because the pandemic is having such a fast changing impact on the economy. So we haven't been able to do that kind of thing yet. And actually in the presentation, here you can see almost like an assessment we have done like data set by data set in the UK about why we can't use it. And I think like that this kind of like problem with the official data that's available about business failure really limits what we can do in our analysis of ultimately almost like the micro impacts of COVID on the economy, which is disappointing for us and the policymakers. But hey, at the end of the day, they are the ones who can maybe tell the Office for National Statistics or companies how to make business failure data available in a way that's more timely and more precise. That was another problem. And then finally, we love like the glass data. We love to work with nice business website data without having to collect it ourselves. And actually they share a lot of information with us, but it's kind of, in terms of reproducibility and openness, is a second best world that we are not able to share everything. So I think it would be nice to, in the future, say if there's ways to create open data sets about this kind of stuff, so that we can be more transparent with what we're sharing and everyone can look at all of our data and reproduce our pipeline from the beginning until the end. But at this point, yeah, it's a second best world in terms of availability of data sources, especially the more esoteric, like a novel ones, like business websites.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice future perspective outlook. So I think we are running towards the end of the seminar, so I really want to thank Juan for this very good presentation and very good debate. It has been really enjoyable, and